Welcome back to Green is Good, and we're so excited to have with us today Mark Kitchell. He's a director, producer, and writer. Welcome to Green is Good, Mark Kitchell.
Oh, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Hey, listen, it's always great to have another NYU alumni on the phone with me here doing a little chat today. I also went to NYU, but not the film school, I'll say. Mark, talk a little bit about your journey. How did you get to be so, creative? You've created this wonderful movie, fiercescreenfire.com. People could go look at it. How did you begin your journey, and how did you get to where you are today?
Well, I grew up in San Francisco in the 60s, which is a good place to get creative. And I was trying to keep up with my older brother, who's a painter, and so I took up the ultimate art form of my time. And NYU was a great place to go to film school. It was very much in the streets in the 70s.
Right.
I did a film about The Godfather 2 being shot on the Lower East Side on my block. And then I went off to Hollywood because it was Rome of my business, and put in my time in the salt mines and got dissatisfied and turned back to documentary and made Berkeley in the 60s, which is, a well-loved classic, one of the defining films about the student movements and things like the counterculture and the Panthers. And then I tried going to work for a living because it was just too damn hard to be such an independent, and I had kids. And so I went into Hollywood, and everything I did was turned into pap. And I was sort of forced back to this, and it was my wife's idea. She said, I know you ought to do the history of the environmental movement. And once again, I had that, I can't believe nobody's done this moment.
Right.
And,
right.
And that was something like 11 years ago. And I was on and off it, been on it pretty much full time since 2008. It was sort of, the making it was framed by those two elections of Obama. And, it's been a great journey. Wow. Putting together the history of the environmental movement.
That is great. And so, and it culminates in this wonderful movie, A Fierce Green Fire.
Yeah. There was a fateful conversation where I went to our advisor, Edward O. Wilson, the famous biologist. And he said, Mark, you're never going to get it made. And if you do, nobody will watch it. It's too long. I was planning a 6-part series. Trying to get everything in. So right there among his ant collection, we sort of dreamed up these 5 main stories that frame the film, which is, the 60s conservation movement, which is, halting dams in the Grand Canyon, the Sierra Club. And the second story is from the 70s and, the new environmental movement, and that's Love Canal and Lois Gibbs fighting 20,000 tons of toxic pollution.
Wow.
And the third story was my choice. It was Greenpeace and the whales. There's much more to that. But the fourth story was Chico Mendes and the Rubber Tappers saving the Amazon. That's just such a heroic story. And then what else could you have on but climate change? And there you sort of had the plot. And it was up to me to sort of build it out from there. And, we did lots of experiments with structure and plot and what's in and out, and whether it would all hang together and form an arc, and whether there really is one environmental movement.
How many years did it take for you to put it together, and when did you wrap the film? When was it complete and edited the way you wanted it?
Well, I worked on it for a few years early in the last decade, from 01 through 03 or 04, and then went away from it and came back in 08. And I think, we got into the Sundance, and that was January 2012, and that was the big push to the finish. I'd started and stopped finishing work 3 times in 2011, and the last time was getting into Sundance, and it was a real miracle getting there.
And why? You mentioned your wife. Why did you? I mean, you're an artist, really, and you're very creative, obviously, and you've had a long history of success. Why did you do the environmental movement? Why focus on that when there's so many other important topics and relevant topics that you could have employed your creative craft on and enjoyed doing also? What happened? What was your tipping point?
Well, in a way, it's the opposite of a tipping point. It was the only movement that hadn't been done to death.
Okay.
Um, we look around as filmmakers and say, well, what can I do? And it felt like everything else had been done. But of course, you can also say it's, the biggest, maybe most important movement the world has ever witnessed. And, it sure deserves
Yeah.
a big picture film that really puts it all together so that people can see what it's about.
And for our listeners out there, I'm on your beautiful website right now. It's unbelievable. There's a trailer on it for our listeners out there who want to see the movie and want to start understanding more about this great and important topic that Mark covered. It's fiercegreenfire.com. Mark, you talked about the 5 acts, really, that you in the 5 different parts of the film. What didn't you put in there? Like, what could have you put in, but what did you leave out? Sometimes that's more telling and more important than what you put in.
Sure. Well, we did find that big important issues like population didn't fit in the movie because there wasn't a popular movement around it. So some issues lent themselves better to this approach than others. A dear friend and colleague looked at me and said, Mark, you got to have the anti-nuclear movement in there. And I did a oops and went back to the drawing board and started putting in all those sort of alternative ecology movements of the early 70s that sort of grew out of the Whole catalog and Bucky Fuller and people like that, and started doing a whole additional piece of the film that I put in front of the Greenpeace and tried to make that act more about alternatives. But the anti-nuke movement fell out again. There's a lot of things. I could go through a long list. I find it interesting that our structure, which is movement-centric, activism-centered, rather than focusing on issues, we tend to focus on movements and activists and what people were doing to take up these issues and fight them. That brought different choices to us. Up until this point, nobody had really told the Love Canal story. But that is such a classic, such a strong story of activism. This is angry housewives with 6 children who end up taking EPA officials hostage to force the president to get them out of there. That sort of story flows from our structure. So there was that kind of thing where
Mark,
we were...
Given your unique position in that you probably had access to all the legacy and state-of-the-art thought leaders, like, say, for the environmental movements that were ongoing and have been ongoing for quite some time. Where are you now? Like, if I was to sit and have lunch with you today, what's big now? Where are we headed? What's the future? And is Mark Kitchell and your wife pessimistic, optimistic, hopeful, despondent? What's going on?
Well, we used to have a part 6 of the film that was going to be about the present and the future, and one nickname for it was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And it's a real mix, and this is the kind of movement that are kind of issues that are getting almost too big, too fundamental for us to deal with. We talk about climate change as the impossible issue, impossible to deal with and yet impossible to ignore. I think I'm a mix, more optimistic than pessimistic. I was trying to get to the big lesson of the piece. And, what I came to was that it's about civilizational transformation. It's about changing our industrial society over to a basis where it's in some sort of sustainable balance with the natural world. And we're just going to have to reinvent the way we make and do almost everything. Some of it will change the way we structure our society. I think we'll come out of this with some modified version of capitalism. But I think there's a lot of things that touches on everything. And I think we're going through a change as big as the Industrial Revolution, which took about 200 years to play out. So I think we're 50 years into a really big civilizational change.
Isn't it shocking, Mark? Though, when you still when you listen to some people who are ideologically based on continuing to deny climate change, do you just continue to just scratch your head and say, what's going on?
Sure, but it's such a big problem.
Yeah.
And I think there's probably 12 steps, just like AA.
Okay.
I think some of those.
Well said. I like that. Talk a little. I want to know how you're distributing this film. Obviously, the world your world of filmmaking and distribution has flattened and become somewhat more democratized with the leveraging of technology and all that kind of stuff. How are you distributing this film and getting the word out? Because it's one thing creating a wonderful work of art, which I know you've done here, and I can't wait to watch myself. I'm on your website. Again, for our listeners out there, it's a fiercegreenfire.com. Look at the trailer. Look at all the cities he's coming to. How did you interrelate with the environmental groups and find distribution and making sure you get the word out now that you've created this piece of art?
Well, I noticed coming back to distribution after maybe 20 years that the money's gone out of it. In the digital era, there's more possibilities than ever, but there seems to be less money driving it. But I did a kind of classic distribution plan where I brought on two distributors, one to do theatrical and video, and the other to do educational and non-theatrical. And I've got a couple sales agents working on festivals and international stuff. And, we're all pushing it in all the classic ways, and we're getting some of those classic deals for broadcast and things like that. But, we went through a 40-city theatrical release this spring, and at the end of it, I said, we didn't begin to scratch the surface. And so I, on my own, decided to do a second round, and I just started calling libraries and churches and schools and environmental groups, large and small, and the smaller ones are responding more than the big ones. And we've, over the course of a couple of months, built, 100 events for the fall and counting. And I figure we're just going to throw ourselves at this and do grassroots work with environmental groups. And there quite literally is no end to the environmental groups. At the end of the film, Paul Hawken talks about 2 million groups, is his estimate, working on these issues. And I started to do a resource guide for the DVD, and 15 pages in, I was only scratching the surface. So it's wonderful to be working with all those people. It's amazing to find how many there are, and it's just
You have to get inspired with all the people you got to meet and touch along your journey, huh?
Yeah, and my ambition was always that this film would be something that would reach out to a lot of people and be of interest, and they'd use it in a lot of ways, and it would be a big film that way for the environmental movement. And
I'm sure it is. Hey, but we have a minute left. Talk about, is Lois Gibbs still around, and what's happened after Love Canal?
Oh, it's a great story. Somebody ought to make a movie about it. They tried doing a TV movie.
You're the guy.
She took her share of the Love Canal settlement money, and took her kids and moved to Washington and started a group to help all the other Loises.
Awesome.
And their motto was plug up all the toilets. And when they had done that, when they had quite literally stopped all new toxic waste dumps in the United States, they then moved on to all sorts of other issues, including a lot of front-of-the-pipeline issues. And she's been at it for 35 years.
I love it.
She's one of the great leaders.
We need that, and we need more people like Mark Kitchell for our listeners out there. It's a fiercegreenfire.com. Watch the movie, get inspired, get involved, and help the movement go forward. Mark Kitchell, you are a creative, inspirational sustainability leader and truly living proof that green is good.